for the right to vote. One of those terms is suffrage. Another term that we've used a lot is enfranchisement. So women's suffrage or woman's suffrage, you say it either way. Women's suffrage or women's suffrage refer to the women's right to vote and advocacy for women's right to vote. So a woman suffragist is a woman who is advocating for the female gender to have suffrage. So women's suffrage was not an issue that women talked about until the early to mid 1800s. Early women like Abigail Adams and other early women in the Revolutionary era did not advocate for women's suffrage. They simply advocated for things like marriage equality, or equality within marriage, equal access to children, things like that. But they did not advocate for the right to vote. So something changes, and I think a lot of that has largely to do with revolutionary ideas of all men created equal, and revolutionary ideas of democracy and what true democracy is begins to politicize women. And prior to this, there weren't really any political issues that women were traditionally involved in. And then in the mid-1800s, the issue of slavery helps to politicize women. So many women become involved in the abolition or anti-slavery and temperance, no alcohol movements. So women like Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton become politicized, but then some women we haven't talked about at all in class yet, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all become politicized. And that just means, it's probably a made-up word, but just means get involved in politics. William Lloyd Garrison was actually a huge advocate for women, and he actually befriended many suffragist leaders and allowed them to lead abolitionist groups and participate in abolitionist groups that he was involved in, and he actually advocated for them within his newspaper. So one of the first acts, or one of the early acts that women make to show their politicization is their organization of the Seneca Falls Convention. And Seneca Falls is a small town in upstate New York, up near Buffalo and Rochester. And this is where women first take a stand for women's suffrage. A group of women and men gathered at a conference in Seneca Falls, and this is in 1848. So in some ways, we're going back in time a little bit. You can see from the sketch of the conference that it wasn't entirely amicable. Men were up in the balconies, taunting the women, teasing them. And you have to remember that at this point in time, women did not speak publicly. There was no need for women to vote because the theory and the philosophy that was that women's votes were provided by their husbands. Their husbands voted on their behalf, just like husbands and mothers vote for children today. Conference attendees at the Seneca Falls Conference wrote the Women's Declaration of Sentiments, which we're going to read in class. And this is essentially a declaration declaring, speaking, saying what their sentiments are, what they are frustrated about. It's essentially the same as the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Sentiments is saying these are the things that are problems for this half of the population, and the power half don't seem to care. And when we're talking about women, it's interesting to note that women are not a minority. In fact, women are a majority of the citizens. I think it's like 51% of our population are female. But women are what's called a power minority, in that despite the fact that the majority of people are women, even to this day, too few women are in Congress, and so we still represent a power minority. So some of the leaders at Seneca are pictured here. The first is Lucretia Mott. She was actually born in Nantucket, so a New Englander. She was born in 1793 and raised just in the post-Revolutionary era, so a very impressionable era for her, and she lived until 1880. So it's important to note that both of these women that I'm about to tell you about did not live to ever vote. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker preacher, and this is a really important point. Almost all of the women in the women's suffrage movement that we are going to learn about are Quakers. And this is significant because the Quaker religion is one of the first Christian religions. It was a progressive New England religion that allowed women to vote, or to speak, to speak and to preach. And this made the religion very progressive because most Christian religions restricted the pulpit from women. And in fact, many women, weren't really seen as religious leaders. Their job was to teach children what they learned at church from the male priest or preacher. So I think it is no coincidence that the first religion to allow women to preach is also the religion that sort of outputs all these women suffragists, because they grow up as Quakers where they have equal rights, equal say in church, but then outside of church in their worlds, they don't have that equality. And so there's sort of a hypocrisy that these women begin to see maybe earlier than some other women do. Lucretia Mott is considered the first women's suffragist, and she is sort of a role model for the future leaders. And you'll notice that she's significantly older than the second lady that I'm going to tell you about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was born in 1815. And even though they both look a little older in these pictures, Lucretia Mott was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's elder. She was a younger suffragist and mother of many children, and that's an important point because a lot of suffragists chose not to have children, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not. She chose to have children. She had a lot of children, and she and her younger cohorts would actually work together, and some of her cohorts would help her raise her kids and babysit them. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's father continually told her, "I wish you were a boy." And that really hurt her. And I think there were sort of two ways to look at that quote, and I'm pulling that quote out of context, but what the father was trying to say here is, you are so bright, you are so intelligent, and unfortunately, because you are a girl, you can't contribute to the family, you can't benefit us like a boy would. And if you were a boy, your life would probably be better. So her father was being supportive there. The mother of suffrage, pictured here next to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, however, is a woman named Susan B. Anthony, and she was born in 1820 and lived until 1906, and she also never lived to vote legally. And legally is the important piece there, because unlike her predecessors, Susan B. Anthony does vote illegally. She is arguably the most famous suffragist. She attended the Seneca Falls Convention and became hooked while there. And she became best friends with Stanton, and over the course of their lives, they worked together sort of as a tag team, a dynamic duo, to get women's suffrage. Together, they co-founded an organization. It was originally NASA with no A, but later on it joined another women's organization and became what's written there, NASA. So it stands for the National American Women's. Actually, I don't know what it stands for. Here we go. National American Women's Suffrage Association. And Susan B. Anthony became the early president of this association. Their two big strategies was to try to win women's suffrage state by state. And so they would go and campaign and petition. And I mean, essentially, they were running presidential campaigns, not presidential campaigns, but issue campaigns, state by state for decades. So this is a huge feat. And their goal was to try to pass a constitutional amendment. Initially, their goal was to allow both women and black men the right to vote, basically saying all citizens have the right to vote. But after the 15th Amendment passes, there are some complications, and so their focus turns to women only. Anthony's tactics. You can see, looking at this political cartoon, that Susan B. Anthony was featured often in the news, and she was portrayed as an evil spinster. Spinster meaning someone who never married, and definitely seen as evil and old and crotchety, as you can see in this picture here. She believed in civil disobedience. So if the laws are unjust, you should not follow the laws, and you should do whatever it takes. When the 14th Amendment passed, which said that all people born or naturalized in the United States were citizens and that all citizens could vote, Susan B. Anthony took this as evidence that she could vote because she was, in fact, a citizen. And all persons were citizens, and she is a person. And so using this legal argument, she voted illegally. She was arrested. The story is kind of funny. She went into the town clerk's office where you register to vote. She and several other women, they went in and they said, "We would like to vote." And the men said, "You cannot vote." And Susan B. Anthony made her argument based on the 14th Amendment. And the poor, silly clerks there had no argument back to her. And so she was permitted to register to vote. And on the voting day, they were allowed to vote, but they voted and their votes were put into a separate ballot box because the men who were collecting the votes and counting the votes were sure that something would happen as a result of this. And a couple days after that presidential election, the sheriff showed up at her house and said that she was going to be arrested. And she refused to go unless he arrested her formally, meaning put her in handcuffs. Excuse me. So she was arrested and jailed, and the case went to trial. She lost, and she appealed. And at her appellate court case, her lawyer argued her 14th Amendment defense, and they concluded that she was incompetent to testify on her own behalf because she was a woman, and she was not allowed to testify at the appellate court. And so that, among some other, sexist issues, she was not, she was fined, and she actually never paid that fine ever in her life. So there's still an outstanding fine for $100 for Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony once said that I am the better writer, she the better critic, and together we have made arguments that no man has answered. She also said, had I married at 20, I would have been a drudge or a doll for 50 years. Think of it. So this is a picture of the two of them working together. In class, we're going to look at the Declaration of Sentiments and complete the women's rights activity. And then we're also going to look at excerpts from Susan B. Anthony's court case.